Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week we conclude the Quenta Silmarillion with the story of Eärendil and the coming of the War of Wrath and, the destruction of Beleriand. But really we're going to be focusing on Eärendil. At least I know Galadriel is, because she's already here in the chat, very excited that it is Eärendil Day. Hello to you, Galadriel. Hello to you, Glorfin David. I am on the record. I've recorded hundreds of hours of podcasts at this point about Tolkien's work, and I think that I have pretty much established my bona fides as like a fan of the high order storytelling that Tolkien engages in. I love the Vala Quenta, if you can remember that far back in our discussion. I love of Aule and Yavanna. I'm a big fan of Tukas and Fingolfin, and to a somewhat lesser extent, Finrod. I love the conversations between Galadriel and Melian, as few of them as there were. They were still very special to me, but I think as of this reading, as of this broadcast, I think I am required contractually to confess that this is my favorite chapter in the Silmarillion. It is just the perfect blend, the perfect synthesis of some forces that I think have been pulling us in different directions over the course of the last chapters. We noted how Beren and Luthien as a story kind of sits a little uncomfortably with what precedes it in the Silmarillion, because we are now turning our focus to the world of men, to the experience of men, to the stakes of men. And that is only heightened, that is only exacerbated as we move into the story of Turin Turambar, which is, as I noted before, a kind of Anglo-Saxon saga of a different sort than the other stories that we get in this book. And then, to flip it all the way to the other end of the spectrum, we get the story of Tuor and the fall of Gondolin, which is a very, very high-level gloss, which is lacking some of that personality, some of the high-stakes dynamism that we saw in those earlier stories. And for me, for my money, for what it's worth, I think that the story of Eärendil and everything that follows thereafter in this chapter is the perfect synthesis of all of these different modes. We have the sweep of history, and we have the movement of great forces. We have all of this mythic content. We're going to return to an etiological myth for the first time in 10 chapters in this book. We're going to give an accounting of the creation of Venus for the residents of Middle-earth, the residents of Arda. I guess everyone gets to enjoy Venus. It's kind of fair in that way. And we're also really deep into personal motivations and what matters to these characters. And we manage to move between these different orders of storytelling with, I think, an ease and a facility, a transparency that really shows what Tolkien is capable of doing. And it's no coincidence, I think, that Eärendil occupies a very specific place in the mythology, a very early place in the mythology, if nothing else. It is not usually counted with the three big stories, right? When we're talking about Beren, and we're talking about Turin, and we're talking about Tuor, right? The three big stories that form the basis of the Legendarium usually don't explicitly exclude Eärendil, but when he is there, it's because he's tacked into the end of the Fall of Gondolin story. That's kind of where he fits. But crucially, Eärendil predates and presages the entire rest of the Legendarium. It's in 1913, when Tolkien is just 21 years old, that he discovers, I'm going to put the slide up right now so you can see it, in fact, when he discovers this in the Christ of the 8th century Anglo-Saxon poet Cynewulf, right? And you can see here this word, Eärendil, which is kind of a neologistic coining here from Cynewulf, meaning Venus. Here, I'll do my best with the Anglo-Saxon that you can see here. I've presented, for those of you listening in the podcast, of course, I have presented here the Anglo-Saxon runes and the direct Anglo-Saxon translation, and then the modern English translation. If you want to see this, then the link to the PDF packet of all the slides that we cover in the session will be, as always, in the show notes. You can go back to any episode of the show and find a downloadable link there for the slides if you want to follow along at home after the fact. But this is what he finds in the work of Cynewulf at the age, as I say, of 21, right back there in 1913. Eala Eärendil, Engla Bertast, Ofer Midengerd Momon Sended. Hail, Eärendil, brightest of angels, above the Middle-earth, sent unto man. And of course, Middle-earth jumps out at us there too. Middle-earth throughout the Anglo-Saxon period, and you can see conflations of this through Germanic myth and Norse myth too, but throughout Anglo-Saxon myth, Middle-earth is the living place of human beings. That is where we are. So here, as I say, Eärendil means Venus, the morning and the evening star. And so inspired is Tolkien by the beauty of the word Eärendil, right, which he credits its euphony for his passion here, that he sits down in the summer of the following year and writes The Voyage of Eärendil, the Evening Star, a short poem. He continues to play with this idea of the embodiment of Venus and arguably, I mean, spins out the entire mythology from this one image, this one character, this one idea. We talked about that a little bit way back at the beginning of this run when we started talking about the foundations of the Silmarillion. So he continues to tweak and reintegrate Eärendil into the legendarium in a number of different ways, which change quite radically through the course of his life. In the 1926 sketch of the entire Silmarillion, which I've described before, Eärendil does pop up 2/3 of the way through to slay Ungoliant, which I think is, extremely cool. But we never get the definitive, developed, complete story of Eärendil. And we don't have it so much that he's only in half of this very brief chapter, for all that he is completely pivotal in the turning here of the end of the First Age. And really, I guess, pivotal in the sense that he both demarcates and executes, right? He is responsible for, he has agency over the great return of hope to Middle-earth, the hope in the deepest points of its despair. We're going, of course, to be talking about Eucatastrophe tonight as we move through. So let's get into it, but we must, of course, rewind just a little bit because that is our way here on Stars and Swords. I wanted to return to Chapter 9 and bring to mind two important passages which are going to echo and recur through the reading tonight as we move through it. So let's call up this slide here. So this is from, as I say, of the flight of the Noldor in Chapter 9, and I'm sure it will be familiar to all of you at home. Then Fëanor swore a terrible oath. His 7 sons leapt straightway to his side and took the self-same vow together, as red as blood shone their drawn swords in the glare of the torches. They swore an oath which none shall break, and none should take, by the name even of Iluvatar, calling the everlasting dark upon them if they kept it or if they kept it not. And Manwë they named in witness, and Varda, and the hallowed mountain of Taniquetil, vowing to pursue with vengeance and hatred to the ends of the world, Vala, demon, elf, or man as yet unborn, or any creature, great or small, good or evil, that time should bring forth unto the end of days, whoso should hold, or take, or keep a Silmaril from their possession. Thus spoke Maithros and Maglor and Caligorm, Curufin and Caranthir, Amrod and Amras, princes of the Noldor, and many quailed to hear the dread words. For so sworn good or evil an oath may not be broken, and it shall pursue oath-keeper and oath-breaker to the world's end. Glad you're back, he's saying in the chat here. So there was this old English teacher back in the day grading his students' parchments and getting a little bored. He turned one over and wrote, Eala Eärendil, England Beofast. See? It all just comes together. I love how, through our frequent retellings of, versions of that story in particular, Tolkien takes on this kind of playful mythic quality himself in his own work, which, let's be clear, he would have hated, right? He would have hated the idea that we are repositioning him outside of his own positioning of himself and his own authorial impulse, I think, within the creative span of the Legendarium, right? He exists as a translator, a very studious and serious and well-principled translator of these works which have come into his possession through the long span of the ages. But yeah, it's so tempting to play with exactly that kind of idea. I noted too in the chat here, Glor from David saying, sounds like a modern day Scottish accent to me. I'm afraid that I only have a limited number of voices, and it may surprise you to learn, for all that you may know of me by this point in the series, that Anglo-Saxon is not an area of special knowledge for me. I think it should be, because I really love Anglo-Saxon poetry, particularly, you can't read that much Tolkien without getting like a sense of Anglo-Saxon poetry. The anarchic, see, even there, I'm showing my Western bias here, right? I'm showing my Romance language bias by describing it as anarchic. The ways in which we play with rhythm and repetition, alliteration in particular, in the Bilbo Song of Eärendil, for example, is very Anglo-Saxon. So some fine day I will have the opportunity to learn a little more about it, but yeah, it's not that day. So for now, we'll just have to make do with the weak voices that I have to offer you as we move through our readings here. So, okay, That is the Oath of Fëanor. I wanted to bring that back to your mind so that we can remember exactly how it is framed and how urgent it is and how it is clearly a bad idea right from the jump, right? The narrative voice does not hesitate when we are getting the oath. None shall break and none should take by the name even of Iluvatar, right? Like, we should not be doing this. And now we're going to see the final consequences. And I mentioned this partly because, of course, it's going to have real plot significance as we move forward, but also to track the consequence of this oath on, in particular, Maglor and Maithros as we get toward the end of tonight's reading, and the ways in which the oath warps what we understand to be their free will, right? They are clearly capable, by the time we get to the end of tonight's reading, of exercising full free will within certain constraints, and the oath is that thing that drives them forth. So I wanted to echo this line: for so sworn, good or evil, an oath may not be broken, and it shall pursue oath keeper and oath breaker to the world's end. Oaths, dangerous things. Of course, the other thing that I wanted to bring back to your memory, to refresh in your reading of this chapter, is, of course, the prophecy of the North, the doom of the Noldor, as delivered at almost the end of chapter 9 there. Quote, "Tears unnumbered ye shall shed, and the Valar will fence Valinor against you and shut you out, so that not even the echo of your lamentation shall pass over the mountains. On the house of Fëanor the wrath of the Valar lieth from the west unto the uttermost east, and upon all that will follow them it shall be laid also. Their oath shall drive them, and yet betray them, and ever snatch away the very treasures that they have sworn to pursue. To evil end shall all things turn that they begin well, and by treason of kin unto kin, and the fear of treason, shall this come to pass. The dispossessed shall they be forever. Ye have spilled the blood of your kindred unrighteously, and have stained the land of Aman. For blood ye shall render blood, and beyond Aman ye shall dwell in death's shadow. For though arrow appointed to you to die not in Ea, and no sickness may assail you, yet slain ye may be, and slain ye shall be, by weapon, and by torment, and by grief. And your houseless spirits shall come then to Mandos. There long shall ye abide and yearn for your bodies, and find little pity, though all whom ye have slain should entreat for you. And those that endure in Middle-earth and come not to Mandos shall grow weary of the world as with a great burden, and shall wane and become as shadows of regret before the younger race that cometh after. The Valar have spoken." These are the terms under which the Noldor are operating in Beleriand, which is going to be very precisely significant, again, as we move through the story of Eärendil and come to the final resolution of, well, to come to the end of the Silmarillion, right? We're going to get a weird little coda right at the end of tonight's reading, in which this is described as the end of the Silmarillion, by which they mean the end of the Quenta Silmarillion, which makes a lot of sense, right? The story of the Silmarils does come to a functional end in tonight's reading. And then we're going to move on to, Numenor and the Second Age and the story of Ar-Pharazôn, which is a good and interesting story. Again, candidly, not my favorite part of the entire book. I think the Second Age needs more development than it gets in the pages of the Silmarillion. And then we get the On the Rings of Power in the Third Age, which is so much fun, but only because we already know the story of the Lord of the Rings. And I wonder if, had Christopher Tolkien known how successful the Silmarillion was going to be upon its publication, had he known that he would have been granted, the better part of 20 books to delve into every aspect, every written word that his father produced through his long and varied career, had he known that that was going to be possible, maybe he wouldn't have included the Akalabaeth and On the Rings of Power in the Third Age, and the end of the Silmarillion would actually have been the end of the Silmarillion, but we can only speculate as to what that world would have been like. Let's get into it then with a Glorfin David's calling out, that's a lot of yees. Yeah, we don't really do that a lot. I don't know. We're just in a much higher rhetorical order there as Mandos, or someone who could, justifiably be Mandos, is right there giving this accounting of doom. So with all that said, and with our memories refreshed on what has gone before, let's waste no more time and get into the story of Eärendil. Bright Eärendil was then the lord of the people that dwelt nigh to Sirian's mouths. And he took to wife Elwing the fair, and she bore to him Elrond and Elros, who are called the Half-Elven. Yet Eärendil could not rest, and his voyages about the shores of the Hitherlands eased not his unquiet. Two purposes grew in his heart, blended as one in longing for the wide sea. He sought to sail thereon, seeking after Tuor and Idril, who returned not, and he thought to find perhaps the last shore, and bring ere he died the message of elves and men to the Valar in the west, that should move their hearts to pity for the sorrows of Middle-earth. Now Eärendil became fast in friendship with Círdan the shipwright, who dwelt on the Isle of Balor with those of his people who escaped from the sack of the havens of Brythombar and Eglarest. With the aid of Círdan, Eärendil built Vingalot, the foam flower, fairest of the ships of song. Golden were its oars and white its timbers, hewn in the birchwoods of Nimberthel, and its sails were as the argent moon. In the lay of Eärendil is many a thing sung of his adventures in the deep and in lands untrodden, and in many seas and in many isles. But Elwing was not with him, and she sat in sorrow by the mouths of Sirion. Eärendil found not Tuor nor Idril, nor came he ever on that journey to the shores of Valinor, defeated by shadows and enchantment, driven by repelling winds, until in longing for Elwing he turned homeward toward the coast of Beleriand. And his heart bade him haste, for a sudden fear had fallen on him out of dreams, and the winds that before he had striven with might not now bear him back as swift as his desire. So, timeline stuff. It is 525. It is 15 years after the fall of Gondolin, after Tuor and Idril go off in their boat, never to be seen again. That is the same year that Eärendil and Elwing get married. Their children, Elrond, yes, that Elrond, and Elros are born in 532. They are 2 years old when Eärendil takes his ship Vingalot to search for Valinor / his parents. At this point, Eärendil and Elwing are 29 years old. Glorfin David says foam flower is right up there with star spray. Now, oh, it is close. It is close. Vingalot has never been one of my favorite words in Tolkien's constructed languages because it feels as though it belongs to something else. There's something about the hard G and the L, and even that terminal T that feels to me Anglo-Saxon, right? That feels to me like he's been pulling it from a slightly different tradition. But yeah, I mean, foam flower is fantastic, and you're right, glossing Elwing's name too, Starspray. I mean, everyone here has a pretty good name, right? Even Eärendil, who just loves the sea so much. It's pretty powerful. Which we note right here, right? Two purposes grew in his heart, blended as one in longing for the wide sea. Oh, well, it turns out that actually everything I want involves me sailing far away, so I'm probably going to just do that and leave my wife at home. It's pretty strong. As I say, Eärendil and Elwing here are 29 years old, and it's probably helpful, I think. Did I write this? I did. Okay, so it's probably helpful at this point to gloss their lineage, because that is going to be pretty important later on. Elwing is the daughter of Dior and Nimloth, previously of Doriath. Nimloth is a Sindar elf from Doriath. She's just part of that line. And Dior is, of course, the son of Beren and Luthien, which is why the book notes that Dior is the hottest person to ever live, because he has the blood of man from his father, elf from his mother, and Maya from his maternal grandmother, Melian. So Elwing, by extension, also draws from men, from elves, and from the Maiar. Eärendil, similarly, is the son of Tuor, son of Huor of the House of Hador, and Idril Celebrimbor, daughter of King Turgon of Gondolin. So he is also a combination of the blood of men and elves, but the crucial difference between his heritage and his wife's heritage is that Eärendil's elven side, coming through Turgon, through Idril, is largely Noldor, with a little Vanyar thrown in through Turgon's wife and Idril's mother, Elenwe. That is contrasted with Elwing's elven side, which is, as far as we can tell, Sindar. She's just Sindar. She is Moraquendi. He is Calaquendi. That is the differences in the elven components in their blood. And we're going to be talking about what this means exactly as we move forward, even into the beginning of next week's reading. But it is important to note that there is no fixed meaning or fixed significance, or even at this point in history, fixed consequence for the term half-elven, for being half-elven. It means different things to different people, and it's going to be formalized as much as it's ever going to be in this week's reading, but that's still not that much. It's extraordinarily powerful and important, but we'll get on to that. So we have this community largely composed at this point of refugees from the fallen cities of Beleriand here in Sirian's Mouths. This is a community, we should note, of both elves and men. We are living together in community at the mouths of the Sirian, and Círdan and his people, under the rulership of King Gil-galad, are currently on the Isle of Balor, because the Falas, their region of the western coast of Beleriand, was also, albeit mostly off-panel, ransacked by Morgoth. So we're here in the mouths of the Syrian, and Eärendil just keeps going out. He's just so urgently desirous of A, being out on the ocean, B, finding his parents, and C, trying to bring ere he died the message of elves and men to the Valar in the West that should move their hearts to pity for the sorrows of Middle Earth, right? So he builds, with the aid of Círdan, this fantastic ship. As we say, it means foam flower. It is, as we might imagine it from Bilbo's song, of course. Her sails he wove of silver fair, of silver were her lanterns made, her prow was fashioned like a swan, and light upon her banners laid. It's just this fantastic ship, though you'll note at this point that it is not made of the mithril and elven glass that Bilbo says that it's made of back in his song. Here, just the birchwoods, the silver birchwoods of Nimberthal, and its sails too, right? As the argent moon, meaning silver. Argent being a heraldic word primarily, I think, in English, but a Latin word meaning silver. So he has all these adventures. See the Lay of Eärendil if you want to hear more about those. But Elwing was not with him, and she sat in sorrow by the mouths of Sirion. And I'm going to just kind of call my shot here as we begin our journey through this chapter, that I think that Eärendil and Elwing is my favorite relationship in this entire book. I think that they have an intimacy and a I don't know, a quality of some connection between them that is kind of informed for me in the story of Beren and Luthien, honestly. It doesn't quite connect for me there as well as this version does. Although, obviously, we get far more of Beren and Luthien's connection than we do of Eärendil and Elwing. So Eärendil suddenly gets this misgiving, right, which you'll note comes to him in dreams. So we might be kind of, glancing across the room at Ulmo, who is probably, looking at his phone or looking at the ceiling or checking his shoes or doing something to avoid our gaze at this point, because we've associated, kind of prophetic visions and dreams with Ulmo before. And he races back to the mouths of the Syrian. But he is, of course, too late, because we are about to witness the third and, thankfully, final kinslaying of the First Age. Now, when first the tidings came to Maethros that Elwing yet lived and dwelt in possession of the Silmaril by the mouths of Sirion, he, repenting of the deeds in Doriath, withheld his hand. But in time the knowledge of their oath unfulfilled returned to torment him and his brothers, and gathering from their wandering hunting paths, they sent messages to the havens of friendship and yet of stern demand. Then Elwing and the people of Sirion would not yield the jewel which Beren had won and Luthien had worn, and for which Dior the Fair was slain. And least of all while Eärendil their lord was on the sea, for it seemed to them that in the Silmaril lay the healing and the blessing that had come upon their houses and their ships. And so there came to pass the last and cruelest of the slayings of elf by elf, and that was the third of the great wrongs achieved by the accursed oath. For the sons of Fëanor that yet lived came down suddenly upon the exiles of Gondolin and the remnant of Doriath and destroyed them. In that battle some of their people stood aside, and some few rebelled and were slain upon the other part, aiding Elwing against their own lords, for such was the sorrow and confusion in the hearts of the Eldar in those days. But Maethros and Maglor won the day, though they alone remained thereafter of the sons of Fëanor, for both Amrod and Amras were slain. Too late the ships of Círdan and Gil-galad the High King came hasting to the aid of the elves of Sirion, and Elwing was gone, and her sons. Then such few of that people as did not perish in the assault joined themselves to Gil-galad and went with him to Balar, and they told that Elros and Elrond were taken captive, but Elwing with the Silmaril upon her breast had cast herself into the sea. And this is our introduction to the struggle that we're going to see play out in Maethros and Maglor through the rest of this chapter. We must remember, of course, that it's hard. I've been referring to them all the way through this series as the worst of the sons of Fëanor, right? Those with sea names. They are long dead. Caranthir and Cudafin and Celegorm are all dead already. So only 4 of the 7 sons of Fëanor remain. And here we see the 2 A names, Amrod and Amras, oftentimes thought to be twins, fall too, leaving only Maethros and Maglor. And Maethros, as we see here, he understands that the kinslaying at Doriath was wrong, and he tries not to repeat history, but the oath twists him. And again, we're going to get a better study of what is happening here later in the chapter, but for now it is enough to know that the sons of Fëanor have become conflicted about their oath and the terrible things that they are driven to do, but that will not stop them from doing those terrible things. The last and cruelest always stands out to me here. As I say, this is the third kinslaying. This is following the murder of the Teleri at Alqualonde and the Sindar at Doriath. But this is perhaps the most grim because this is even, 15 years after the fall of Gondolin. It is still functionally I guess we're closer to 30 years after the fall of Gondolin at this point. It is still functionally a refugee camp, right? This is not a great city that has been built like a fortress. This is just the last remnant, like the absolute dregs. I know that the study that I referenced before, whose name is going to escape me. I wonder if I can quickly find that as I search. Stephen Wigmore, yes, the academic inquiry conducted by Stephen Wigmore into the population of Beleriand puts the number at the height of Beleriand's activity at around 1.25 million elves scattered across Beleriand, almost fully half of whom live in Doriath. And though we don't have any numbers now, it's hard to think that there are maybe more than a few tens of thousands, if that, remaining. We have seen carnage. So the assault here on the elves of Sirion, and the men of Sirion too, the assault on this last camp is just, unconscionable, even by the standards of Maithros and Maglar, particularly because, of course, it ends in the taking of Elros and Elrond, more about them, in a moment, but also the supposed death of Elwing, as Glorfin David notes, another casting oneself into the sea. Yeah, we're getting the typology coming thick and fast here, right? We're getting a few echoes as we move through this story of things which we have seen actually quite recently. I'm thinking in particular of Eärendil being fatigued, of being worn and exhausted by the world in exactly the same way as his father was, in exactly the same way as Hurin was, right? We've seen this pattern establish itself. And yeah, of course, casting yourself into the sea, also very popular among despairing men of Beleriand at this point. Men, capital men, humans, mankind, menfolk here in Beleriand at this point. Per the timeline, as I say, this is the year 538 of the years of the sun. So let's move on and see what happened, because I have to reassure you that Elwing does not die at this time. Thus Maithros and Maglar gained not the jewel, but it was not lost. For Ulmo bore up Elwing out of the waves, and he gave her the likeness of a great white bird, and upon her breast there shone as a star the Silmaril, as she flew over the water to seek Eärendil her beloved. On a time of night, Eärendil at the helm of his ship saw her come towards him, as a white cloud exceedingly swift beneath the moon, as a star over the sea moving in strange course, a pale flame on wings of storm. And it is sung that she fell from the air upon the timbers of Vingalot in a swoon, nigh unto death for the urgency of her speed, and Eärendil took her to his bosom, but in the morning, with marvelling eyes, he beheld his wife in her own form beside him, with her hair upon his face, and she slept. Great was the sorrow of Eärendil and Elwing for the ruin of the havens of Sirion and the captivity of their sons, and they feared that they would be slain. But it was not so, for Maglar took pity upon Elros and Elrond, and he cherished them, and love grew after between them, as little might be thought. But Maglar's heart was sick and weary with the burden of the dreadful oath. I am not so quietly a huge fan of Ulmo's orchestration of the entire end of the Quintus Silmarillion, from where do we begin? From telling Finrod and Turgon to go build their hidden cities in the first place, right? Then the provision of the armor and the weapon in Nevrest for Tuor, and now he's just like nakedly intervening in these events as they unfold. This direct rescue of Elwing and the Silmaril, though maybe we don't credit Ulmo completely with responsibility for this save, since we noticed last week that, swans and this great white bird here, right, that they are a kind of combination of the domains of Ulmo and Manwë. So maybe the Valar, and perhaps even the king of the Valar, are still as ever working together. And we'll note here too, as we really tighten the screws on the remaining sons of Fëanor, that Maglar proves himself to be a good person because of the conflict with his oath, right? And when he is not directly driven by his oath, he can still show kindness, show love, and earn the love of Elros and Elrond, whom he takes from the havens of Syria, right? He basically abducts these boys, and maybe we can speculate, if we're feeling particularly cynical at this point in the Silmarillion, and honestly, who could blame us given all that we've endured to get here? If we're feeling cynical, we can maybe, wonder if there is some Middle-earth version of Stockholm out there from which we might derive a syndrome, but I read this as being much more genuine, much more authentic, much more true, that Maglor shows genuine pity, right? One of the great virtues. He is piteous in this moment. Maglor takes pity upon Elros and Elrond and cherishes them, and love grew after between them as little might be thought. The narrative just lampshading how unlikely that probably seems to the reader, and yet it did happen. It is a thing that we can credit to Maglor there. I love... I just mentioned how much I like the relationship between Eärendil and Elwing. This is one of my favorite moments in that. The intimacy here. And we have to remember that, well, we kind of have to, we have our cake and eat it too here, right? Because on the one hand, it seems as though Eärendil recognizes the Silmaril, right? Certainly that is a familiar sight to him. On a time of night, Eärendil sat at the helm of his ship, saw her come towards him as a white cloud exceeding swift beneath the moon, as a star over the sea moving in strange course, a pale flame on wings of storm. Like, okay, Tolkien's really kind of locked in this chapter for sure. And it is sung that she fell from the air upon the timbers of Vingalot in a swoon, nigh unto death for the urgency of her speed. So she is transformed by Ulmo in this moment and dashes across the sea, finds Eärendil, crashes into the deck of the boat, and passes out, in effect, right? And Eärendil took her to his bosom. So he's just gathering this bird to his chest to care for it. This bird that happens to be carrying the Silmaril, but is it impossible that Ulmo could have convinced, or Manwë could have convinced a bird to carry the Silmaril? Like, maybe not. But in the morning with marveling eyes, he beheld his wife in her own form beside him, with her hair upon his face, and she slept. There is a lovely and basically unprecedented intimacy to that moment that really works for me. I am honestly very moved by the story of Eärendil. As I say, when all of these different narrative modes are all firing at once and unified in their effect, so that we can move from the scourge of the Oath of the Sons of Fëanor into, and then Ulmo arose from the ocean and turned her into a swan, into, and there was his wife with her hair upon his face, right? Just that lovely kind of entanglement of physical body right there, which is, again, enormously intimate and really dissimilar to the other kinds of romantic relationships that we get. So let's move ever onward then and see what decision Eärendil and Elwing make, believing, of course, that their sons are, well, knowing for sure that their sons have been captured, and believing with really no reason to doubt this belief that they are in fact dead. Yet Eärendil saw now no hope left in the lands of Middle-earth, and he turned again in despair and came not home, but sought back once more to Valinor with Elwing at his side. He stood now most often at the prow of Vingalot, and the Silmaril was bound upon his brow, and ever its light grew greater as they drew into the west. And the wise have said that it was by reason of the power of that holy jewel that they came in time to waters that no vessels save those of the Teleri had known. And they came to the enchanted isles and escaped their enchantment. And they came to the shadowy seas and passed by their shadows. And they looked upon Tol Eressëa, the lonely isle, but tarried not. And at the last they cast anchor in the bay of Eldamar. And the Teleri saw the coming of that ship out of the east, and they were amazed, gazing up from afar upon the light of the Silmaril, and it was very great. Then Eärendil, first of living men, landed on the immortal shores, and he spoke there to Elwing and to those that were with him, and there were 3 mariners who had sailed all these seas behind him. Falathar, Erilont, and Eärendil were their names. And Eärendil said to them, Here none but myself shall set foot, lest you fall under the wrath of the Valar. But that peril I will take on myself alone for the sake of the 2 kindreds. But Elwing answered, Then would our paths be sundered forever, but all thy perils I will take on myself also. And she leapt into the white foam and ran towards him. But Eärendil was sorrowful, for he feared the anger of the lords of the west upon any of Middle-earth that should dare to pass the leaguer of Aman. And there they bade farewell to the companions of their voyage, and were taken from them forever. Then Eärendil said to Elwing, Await me here, for one only may bring the message that is my fate to bear. And he went up alone into the land, and came into the Calakiria, and it seemed to him empty and silent, for even as Morgoth and Ungoliant came in ages past, so now Eärendil had come at a time of festival, and well nigh all the elven folk were gone to Valimar, or were gathered in the halls of Manwë upon Taniquetil, and few were left to keep watch upon the walls of Tirion. After all this time, we are back. I cannot deny how powerfully this passage works on me. Both sides of it, really. Again, right, I'm going to observe just the sheer style here, just the rhetorical power. This really is Tolkien leveraging his greatest skills as a poet to communicate all of this. We have little moments, right? We have the contrast here. He stood now most often at the prow of Ingolot, and the Silmaril was bound upon his brow. You can hear, as I say that out loud, the alliteration and the rhythm of that, and obviously the connection there between prow and brow. We get this lovely kind of echo in the phrases as they pass. They came to the enchanted isles and escaped their enchantment. They came into the shadowy seas and passed their shadows, and they looked upon tall Erisea, the lonely isle, but tarried not. There's just this rising rhythm as we go, and again, right, we're really playing with our sentence length here. You can always, I think, sense when Tolkien's getting into that highest and most declamatory register, because the sentences get very long. We start seeing those semicolons just dropping all over the place. And then we're there against all expectation. I mean, it's been so long. It's been literally months of this podcast since we were last in Valinor, and now here we are. And we get the credit. I'll credit these. Well, I'm hesitating there because I almost said elves and then I almost said men, and it's occurring to me now that we don't know whether these are elves or men. They do seem to have Sindarin names, but that doesn't tell us anything at this point in the history of Beleriand. Falithar, Eärendil, and Eärendil are their names, and of course we're going to get some very straight translations here, or we're going to get two very straight translations. Falithar glosses as beyond the shore, Eärendil means sea wanderer, and Eärendil isn't translated by Tolkien, but there are some thoughts that it might mean lonely ship in a local kind of Mouths of Syrian dialect of Sindarin, which might suggest that he's a man. If he's been named that recently, that he is being named locally in the Mouths of Syrian, right? You'll remember, actually, it's not in this book. It's in the rituals of the Eldar, or whatever that chapter is called, that I've mentioned a couple times before, and the name of which will not stick in my head. We are told that elves seldom wed and thus seldom have children during times of conflict. So it doesn't seem as though many elves are being born at this point in Beleriand. But those are our three, and they will basically vanish from the story. We'll get a little nod to them later, but that's... yeah, you know, Galadriel saying seems like those Valinorians party constantly. Isn't it fascinating to pull this turn here? And Glorfin David's calling out exactly this, right? Strange to link Eärendil to Morgoth and Ungoliant in this way to some purpose. Yes, isn't it fascinating? So this is, again, right, our typology really paying off at this point. We've observed before how festivals are dangerous. Don't throw a party, y'all. I can think of one successful party, which is the kind of party of reunification that is held when the Noldor come to Beleriand in the first place. I think, and even that kind of, sparks conflict going forward. But that is maybe the only successful party that we've seen. But every time the Valar in particular want to throw a big festival or rest after Tukas's wedding to Nessa, that kind of thing, bad things happen. And you're right, we're getting this exact point of comparison. And I think that the reason here is not to equate Eärendil with either Morgoth or Ungoliant, but rather to remind us of the shadows that we have seen fall upon this land, right? This is not immune because we haven't had any direct experience of it. So what we're doing here, I think, is we are positioning Eärendil in such a way as he can be frightened, not of what is waiting for him, but frightened, despairing, in fact, that there is no hope in the West. Despairing that having overcome all of these obstacles, having passed through the leaguer of Aman, right? You'll remember that the Valar very deliberately put there to stop people from coming to Aman. Having managed to find his way through all of this, that now there is no hope. And that we really play with. I find it extremely moving to come up into the Calacaria, right? The cleft here between the Pelori, between the mountains here on the east coast of Aman. And to find it empty and silent is ominous. I find it genuinely spooky. I think there's something very powerful at work here. And yes, calling up, evoking their Morgoth and Ungoliant, but only for a moment, because the narrator is going to pull all the way out. Eärendil doesn't know this, but he had come at a time of festival, and well nigh all the elven folk were gone to Valamar, or were gathered in the halls of Manwë upon Taniquil, which was exactly the circumstance, you'll remember, when Morgoth and Ungoliant came and took down the trees and darkened Valinor. So we're positioning, and again, right, as I'm talking about the synthesis of all of Tolkien's different rhetorical modes here, this is the human mode. This is his personal mode. This is the heroic mode. We're very close to the ground. We're very close to Eärendil's emotional state here, right? We get these, moments of accounting of him in a really interesting way. As we get Elwing too, right? Then would our paths be sundered forever, but all thy perils I will take on myself also. And she leapt into the white foam and ran toward him, but Eärendil was sorrowful, for he feared the anger of the lords of the west upon any of Middle-earth. We're not taking action in that moment. I mean, Elwing is taking action, but Eärendil, we're just getting a note on his emotional state. We're feeling the reality of him standing in the surf here on the shores of Aman, with the mountains of the Pelori rising higher and higher and higher behind him as he's looking out back into the east, back toward his ship, back toward his companions, back toward his wife, who is now running toward him through the foam, right? This is, it's cinematic, if nothing else, but it's also enormously emotionally immediate for me, at least, as I'm reading these passages. Let's continue this as we move further. And did I note everything that I wanted to note about this? I did want to note a couple things more, I suppose. The first is that it's skimmed over in the text. Obviously, we don't really get, he turned again in despair and came not home, but sought back once more to Valinor with Elwing at his side. 4 years is the voyage to Valinor. 4 years to pick their way between the enchanted isles and the shadowy seas, and to make their way past Tol Eressëa, the lonely isle, the remnant, you'll remember, of the Isle of Balar that Ulmo uprooted and swept away. So now we're kind of contrasting as well the two sides of Biligair, the Great Sea, right? We've kind of got Tol Eressëa here, and we know now that Círdan and Gil-galad, the High King Gil-galad, and the other elves are living on the Isle of Balar, back in the Bay of Balar at the mouths of the Sirion. So 4 years it takes to complete this journey. And I suppose the other thing that I really want to pin before we get into Valinor proper is the fear that Eärendil's feeling here, because, again, right, we're going to get a better opportunity to talk about this in a couple of slides' time, but I want to, and better yet, in next week's reading, for sure. But I think it's just the existence of the magic security fence, right, which suggests that you're not supposed to be here. And Eärendil, crucially, would definitely have known of all the other missions that had been sent by Turgon into the west, and that all of those missions had failed. He probably does know the story of the sole survivor of those ships sent by Turgon into the west to try and find Valinor, which is, of course, his dad's old buddy Voronwë, who also, according to some versions of the story, disappeared with Tuor and Idril when they took their leave of the havens of Sirion. So he's familiar with the idea that this is a dangerous mission, and presumably familiar with the threat that now awaits him. Let's move on, which is, a threat that is going to be, if not realized, then at least addressed for sure. But some there were who saw him from afar, and the great light that he bore, and they went in haste to Valimar. But Eärendil climbed the green hill of Tuna and found it bare, and he entered into the streets of Tirion, and they were empty. And his heart was heavy, for he feared that some evil had come even to the blessed realm. He walked in the deserted ways of Tirion, and the dust upon his raiment and his shoes was a dust of diamonds, and he shone and glistened as he climbed the long white stairs. And he called aloud in many tongues, both of elves and men, and there were none to answer him. Therefore he turned back at last toward the sea. But even as he took the shoreward road, one stood upon the hill and called to him in a great voice, crying, "Hail, Eärendil of mariners most renowned, the looked-for that cometh at unawares, the longed-for that cometh beyond hope. Hail, Eärendil, bearer of light before the sun and moon, splendor of the children of earth, star in the darkness, jewel in the sunset, radiant in the morning." That voice was the voice of Eönwë, herald of Manwë, and he came from Valimar and summoned Eärendil to come before the powers of Arda. And Eärendil went into Valinor and into the halls of Valimar, and never again set foot upon the lands of men. Then the Valar took counsel together, and they summoned Ulmo from the deeps of the sea, and Eärendil stood before their faces and delivered the errand of the two kindreds. Pardon, he asked, for the Noldor, and pity for their great sorrows, and mercy upon men and elves, and succor in their need. And his prayer was granted. So this moment of hopelessness that he feels. We're playing with these notions of eucatastrophe, right? We're playing with these moments of despair, the crack that lets the light in. We're playing with this idea that it is when we completely surrender that there are opportunities for intercessory grace, right? This is all built out of Professor Tolkien's belief in the real world and a benevolent God, and his belief within the bounds of his secondary creation of a different, well, not different, of a slightly renamed but equally benevolent God, right? The world sometimes in catastrophe works out, that it is in these moments of darkest, bleakest hopelessness, which is, to be clear, what Eärendil is feeling here at this point. He climbs the hill of Tuna, he goes into the streets of Tirion, there's nobody there, and we're building the irony here, right, of the white stairs and the dust of diamonds all over his raiment and his shoes, glittering, kind of foreshadowing what he is also going to become at the end of this story. He's crying out, but there is no one there. He doesn't see those who are watching him from afar. He is, lit up like a Christmas tree thanks to the light of the Silmaril. So he doesn't see those that glimpse him from afar and then flee off to Valimar to presumably summon Eönwë, to let Eönwë know. But then we get the turn. And when he gives up hope, he turns back to the shoreward road, but one person is standing there and calls out to him, and this is, so effusive and so welcome and so loving. Hail Eärendil, of mariners most renowned, and not just that he's special, right? Not just that he is the most famous, mariner in all the world, but that he is himself kind of a eucatastrophe. He is a eucatastrophe for Valinor, for the Valar, for the Maya, for the elves who still dwell here, the looked for that cometh at unawares. Right? We were looking for you, and here you are when we weren't looking anymore. The longed for that cometh beyond hope. That's our eucatastrophe. There is despair in Valinor because they want someone from Middle-earth to come. And here he is, the longed for that cometh beyond hope. Hail Eärendil, bearer of light before the sun and moon. The light of the Silmaril that he carries is the light of Telperion, the light of Laurelin. It was the only light before the sun and moon were ever in the sky. Splendor of the children of earth, star in the darkness, jewel in the sunset, radiant in the morning. And that's where we pivot, right? That's where we turn. That's where we move just slightly into something that is more like the prophetic voice. And to be clear, it is prophecy here. That's what we're getting from Eönwë is a prediction of the future. He doesn't know for sure how these things are going to play out. He doesn't know what's going to happen in Valimar. He doesn't know what happens when we're in the Ring of Judgment. And Eärendil is addressing the gathered Valar. He's not sure how this is going to play out, but he has this moment of prophecy. And what do we know of moments of prophecy? That they normally come at moments of despair, at moments of hopelessness, at moments where we fear that death is imminent, right? When you are Fae, you are very likely to get a moment of prophecy. That's not quite where Eönwë seems to be here, but it does seem to be mirroring this sense of despair. We've mentioned Eönwë before, one of the 6 Maiar who are mentioned in the Valaquenta, which we studied, as I say, like 5 months ago, however long that was. We get Elmare, who is the handmaiden of Varda, Eönwë, the herald of Manwë, who is, we should note at this point, to again refresh our memories, Eönwë, who is the most skilled at arms of anyone in Arda, surpassing anyone, surpassing Orome, surpassing Tukas, right? You remember our long discussions back when we were looking at the Valaquenta, that there is no like foundational categorical difference between the Valar and the Maiar. They are all Ainur who descended into the world, and it's just like the bosses, in some extent the strongest, but in some extent just the most important that get the title Valar, but there isn't a categorical difference. And sometimes particular Maiar are stronger even than the Valar, and Eönwë is one such. He is the strongest at arms of anybody in Arda. So we get Ilmare, as I said, we get Eönwë. We mention Ose and Weenan, who work with Ulmo. You might remember them. We mention Melian. Melian gets a pop right there in the Valaquenta, throwing forward to her role in Beleriand. And we get a guy called Olorin, who doesn't play a part in this story, not until we get to the very last chapter of the book and the Rings of Power and the Third Age, at least. So this is, I think, to kind of come back to our discussion on the previous slide here, this is where we pay off that idea of eucatastrophe, right? We get this simultaneous eucatastrophe for Eärendil and by Eärendil, that he is the looked for that cometh unawares, the longed for that cometh beyond hope, and he's also feeling the same moment of, holy smokes, there are people here, and I am being welcomed, and I am being recognized, and I am being praised, right? Not to suggest that praise is that important to Eärendil. I don't think he's just looking for a gold star for this little adventure, but that it means that there is hope again. His hope is restored to him all at once. And of course, he performs the act that he came here to perform. He delivers the errand of the two kindreds. Pardon he asked for the Noldor, and pity for their great sorrows, and mercy upon man and elves, and succor in their need, and his prayer was granted. And we've talked before about those incredibly punchy, short. This is another way in which we're kind of inverting that Melkorian idea, that Morgothian idea of the very short sentence that is incredibly ominous, right? And she stank, and Morgoth came, and Maeglin was silent. And here we're completely flipping that on its head with maybe the best thing that happens in terms of just, raw goodness. Like, this is the best event that happens in the First Age, in all of Arda up to this point. Like, it's really hard to be sure, but the begging for forgiveness, the pardon he asked for the Noldor, and pity for their sorrows, and mercy upon elves and men, and succor in their need. These four things that's what he's asking for. And each requires a kind of wisdom and an extension of grace. We're going to talk a little more about that when we get back to Morgoth showing up weirdly in the pages of this chapter for just a minute. So, and his prayer was granted, which was the original title for tonight's session, but I didn't want to spoil it. It is told among the elves that after Eärendil had departed, seeking Elwing his wife, Mandos spoke concerning his fate, and he said, "Shall mortal man step living upon the undying lands, and yet live?" But Ulmo said, "For this he was born into the world. And say unto me, whether is he Eärendil, Tuor's house of the line of Hador, or the son of Idril, Turgon's daughter of the elven house of Finwë?" And Mandos answered, "Equally the Noldor, who went willfully into exile, may not return hither." But when all was spoken, Manwë gave judgment, and he said, "In this matter the power of doom is given to me. The peril that he ventured for love of the two kindreds shall not fall upon Eärendil, nor shall it fall upon Elwing his wife, who entered into peril for love of him. But they shall not walk again ever among elves or men in the outer lands. And this is my decree concerning them. To Eärendil and to Elwing and to their sons shall be given leave each to choose freely to which kindred their fates shall be joined, and under which kindred they shall be judged." Now when Eärendil was long time gone, Elwing became lonely and afraid, and wandering by the margin of the sea, she came near to Alqualonde, where lay the Teleran fleets. There the Teleri befriended her, and they listened to her tales of Doriath and Gondolin and the griefs of Beleriand, and they were filled with pity and wonder. And there Eärendil returning found her at the haven of the swans. But ere long they were summoned to Valimar, and there the decree of the elder king was declared to them. I do love very much this little argument here between Mandos and Ulmo. And it does sound a little like an argument, but I have to interpret this as a sincere question from Mandos. I don't think, despite what we read earlier in The Doom of the Noldor, that, or the prophecy of the North that is delivered to the Noldor, the Doom of Mandos, right, as it's often referred to. I don't think that we're supposed to interpret this as Mandos pursuing an argument, right, or making a point. I think he's genuinely asking the question, shall mortal man step living upon the undying lands and yet live? Do we have a quorum on this? Have we decided exactly how this is going to play out? Because clearly a decision needs to be made. And Ulmo, arguing with him in a brilliant Ulmolian way, replies, well, he's not really mortal man. Are you aware that he's the son of Idril, Turgon's daughter of the elven house of Finwë? To which Mandos replies very fairly, then he's Noldor, and that means that he definitely shouldn't be left alive, because of a very explicit prophecy of the North that I delivered to the Noldor, or some agent who looks a lot. I don't know who it was that did it. He was real handsome though, like a real good-looking dude. So I mean, yeah, that's all I've heard. Anyway, I definitely wasn't there for it. I was at home the whole evening. If he's Noldor, then he is explicitly to be put to death, and if he is man, then maybe he's to be put to death. But Manwë intercedes. In this matter, the power of doom is given to me, right? and again, that he is inheriting this power of doom from Iluvatar. It feels as though we're getting one of those moments when Manwë again kind of, sinks into his reverie, into his memory of the music, and new wisdom comes to him in that moment, right? In this matter, the power of doom is given to me. He's not going to be punished for coming here. He's not going to be punished for his love of the two kindreds. Elwing's not going to be punished for her love of Eärendil. These are good things. These shall be, appropriate. But obviously they can't go back. They can't return to Middle-earth. And this is my decree: to Eärendil and to Elwing and to their sons shall be given leave each to choose freely to which kindred their fates shall be joined and under which kindred they shall be judged. So they get to pick whether or not they are going to be as mortal men or they are going to be as immortal elves, and then things will play out as they should. This half-elven thing is a little complicated because you don't have a fixed fate. You don't have a fixed role in Arda. These are different things, right? And it's a strange thing to try and wrestle with completely because, particularly if you're coming to this in a post-Gygaxian, post-Dungeons and Dragons, last week I mentioned the Weiss and Hickman Dragonlance books set on Krynn. If you come to this book, this moment through that door, well, you're just kind of accustomed to the idea that they were just half-elves and they get like slightly different racial bonuses and like slightly different perks, and maybe they're better suited to certain careers. But this is not that. To be half-elven is to be caught between two fates. And what Manwë here is demanding is absolutely, giving the freedom to choose. You define yourself. You still have free will, but you do have to choose one way or the other. You do have to choose, these choose between these incompatible fates. The only person that we've seen do something similar, of course, is Luthien. We didn't get to Dior. We don't know how that would have played out for Dior. We don't know if Dior inherited his mother's mortality, right? By the time he is born, Luthien has kind of taken up being human, but I mean, obviously he hasn't, because he has passed on this half-elven potential to Eärendil. So it's interesting to think of that as sorry, he didn't pass on anything to Eärendil. Let's not be scandalous here. Let's not suggest too much. He passed on that potential to Elwing, of course. Tuor and Idril Celebrimbor passed on that same potential to Eärendil. But this still needs to be resolved. So Dior is the outstanding example there. It's interesting to think about this only because there are so few examples of intermarriage between elves and men. I mean, I know we've been talking about it a lot lately, but there are 4 in the entire Legendarium, 4 documented cases. There may be others, but 4 documented cases. And that's it, right? We've got Beren and Luthien, we've got Tuor and Idril, we've got Eärendil and Elwing, and we've got, some guy called Aragorn, some lady called Arwen that we'll talk about at some point in the very distant future. I almost slipped there as I want to do and said near future, but yeah, not that soon. Okay, we've still got a distance to go and we're almost an hour in, so let's pick up. Oh, we will talk more, I will say, in next week's reading about how this choice really functions, like how the rubber of this judgment hits the road of fate when we get into next week's reading and we look at what happens to Elros and Elrond. Let's call up the next slide and then look at this great moment of I'm struggling to find the word. There is a word here that I want, but I cannot quite get to it. Look at this moment of Eärendil being a good husband and listening to his wife. A thing that we don't see much of in the Silmarillion, right? We don't see a lot of it in Tolkien's work in general, in fact, despite the fact that by all accounts he was a very good husband. But here we get, unlike unlike the other examples that we've had in the past, now Eärendil is going to kind of follow his wife's wisdom and follow her urging. Then Eärendil said to Elwing, "Choose thou, for I am weary of the world." And Elwing chose to be judged among the firstborn children of Iluvatar because of Luthien. And for her sake, Eärendil chose alike, though his heart was rather with the kindred of man and the people of his father. Then at the bidding of the Valar, Eonwë went to the shore of Aman where the companions of Eärendil still remained, awaiting tidings, and he took a boat, and the 3 mariners were set therein, and the Valar drove them away into the east with a great wind. But they took Vingalot, and hallowed it, and bore it away through Valinor to the uttermost rim of the world, and there it passed through the door of night, and was lifted up even into the oceans of heaven. Now fair and marvellous was that vessel made, and it was filled with a wavering flame, pure and bright, and Eärendil the mariner sat at the helm, glistening with dust of elven gems, and the Silmaril was bound upon his brow. Far he journeyed in that ship, even into the starless voids, but most often was he seen at morning or in evening, glimmering in sunrise or sunset, as he came back to Valinor from voyages beyond the confines of the world. On those journeys Elwing did not go, for she might not endure the cold and the pathless voids, and she loved rather the earth and the sweet winds that blow on sea and hill. Therefore there was built for her a white tower northward upon the borders of the sundering seas, and thither at times all the seabirds of the earth repaired. It is said that Elwing learned the tongues of birds, who herself had once worn their shape, and they taught her the craft of flight, and her wings were of white and silver grey. And at times, when Eärendil, returning, drew near again to Arda, she would fly to meet him, even as she had flown long ago when she was rescued from the sea. Then the far-sighted among the elves that dwelt in the lonely isle would see her like a white bird, shining, rose-stained in the sunset, as she soared in joy to greet the coming of Vingalot to haven. Glorfin David noting in the chat, I'm very fond of the oceans of heaven. Yeah, me too. This is two things. We'll dispense with the more mundane is exactly the wrong word, in fact, but I'm going to use it nonetheless. We're going to dispense with the mundane reason for this pretty swiftly. This, as I mentioned earlier, is an etiological myth. It is an explanatory myth about the existence of Venus, the morning or the evening star, which seemed very unpredictable to scholars and astronomers of an earlier age. But it is, more importantly, a recognition of the nature of Eärendil, right? Eärendil was a mariner. Eärendil is a mariner. To be a mariner is to be Eärendil, or I guess vice versa. And now he gets to sail these uncharted seas forever. He's literally, sailing in space. And that's going to also have a function, which we'll get to in the slides to come. I want to call out two things right at the beginning of this slide. I mentioned one earlier, right? Choose thou, for I am weary of the world. Weary of the world is hitting him fast, right? He's like 35 at this point, and that's younger even than his father was when he gave up on the world too and just decided that he wanted to go to the sea. But Eärendil's been through it, and we can also possibly speculate about the effect of being in Valinor, right? We've learned that being too close to objects of power, of objects of, well, I'm tempted to use the word holiness, but that's not quite what I mean, right? We saw this with Luthien, right? Or there was speculation, at least, that when Luthien wore the Silmaril, she burned out faster. And Eärendil's been wearing the Silmaril. He's also been kind of ground down by it, or exhausted by it, fatigued by it. It has been taken, something has been taken from him, something has been consumed in him, Fëanor style here. And now he's in Valinor, and we have reason to believe that the same thing is true here, that this is one of the reasons that men can't come to Valinor. This is kind of foreshadowing what we're going to be discussing next week, but one of the reasons that men can't come to Valinor is that they just wouldn't survive it. It's just too beautiful and brilliant and amazing, and they would be burned out. So we're just getting the typology again here of Eärendil's fatigue. He is weary of the world. And Elwing, in response, taking the burden of this decision upon herself, oh, this is just fascinating, right? Chose to be judged among the firstborn children of Ilúvatar because of Luthien. I want to be an elf because of the person who chose to not be an elf. My grandmother who chose not to be an elf. And there's a sense here, is there a degree to which she is balancing the scales, or believes that she is balancing the scales? Is there a degree to which she believes that something has perhaps been lost? Which you'll remember is certainly how the elves talk about Luthien, right? Like her decision to become mortal is a tragedy. It is a terrible thing that happens. Not that it is morally wrong or that she shouldn't be allowed to do it, because again, free will is so important, but that something irreplaceable, something infinitely precious is lost from the world. We talked a little about that with Melian choosing to return to Valinor too. But she makes the choice, and Eärendil goes with her. He chose alike, though his heart was rather with the kindred of men and the people of his father. Why does he choose to go with his wife? Because she's his wife. Because we're not going to be together all the time, right? This is one of the most interesting and kind of mature things that I've ever seen. There's a juvenile version of this story where they both have a tower on the Sundering Sea and they just go and live there, and it's perfect. Kind of the Beren and Luthien resolution, right? They're just done. Their story is over, so they go and they live on a little island, and that's it until they die, right? Paused briefly so that Beren can go to war, I guess. But their story is over because they are unified romantically, and that's not their story. This is a more mature and realistic and relatable kind of domestic harmony. They both have their lives. They both have their passions. She doesn't want to go into space. She doesn't like it. She loves the earth and the sweet winds that blow on sea and hill. She loves birds. She wants to go and talk with birds because she was once in their form, and now they teach her to fly, and not just fly, but to take the form of a bird, right? She can speak with the birds and fly like the birds. Her wings were of white and silver gray. So Eärendil goes off to do the thing that he does, and she goes off to do the thing that she does. But then when they are reunited, it is real joy. Then the far-sighted among the elves that dwelt in the lonely isle would see her like a white bird, shining, rose-stained in the sunset as she soared in joy to greet the coming of Vingalot to Haven. And this idea of Haven, this idea of coming home, of coming to a safe harbor after your perilous journeys through, obviously just thinking a little bit of... because D&D, I guess, is on my mind tonight. Just thinking a lot about Starjammer. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the Starjammer modules for D&D that are literally, have a big sailing ship that sails through space, and yeah, Eärendil goes and gets his adventures. We're not done with Eärendil yet, and we're not done with Eärendil even being a mariner for now, but we do have to cut back to Middle-earth. Yes, Gladrek is saying, we saw this with Frodo too, weariness of the world from the power of the ring. Yes, it's fascinating, right? It's very difficult to do the comprehensive compare and contrast with the influence of the ring versus the influence of the Silmaril. It doesn't seem as though the influence of the Silmaril is malevolent in the way that the influence of the ring is. It doesn't seem as though the influence of the Silmaril compels you in the same way as the ring clearly and obviously compels you. And obviously, though the Silmarils are not the cause of great ill themselves, right? In the way that the ring is manifestly and expressly evil. The One Ring is manifestly and expressly evil. And that is not true of the Silmarils. The Silmarils are not created with the intent that they should be destructive, but boy, that doesn't stop them from taking a huge toll and causing a great deal of collateral damage. It is, yeah, I think you're completely right to call it out, Galadriel. It is something that I think about and wonder about, and it's not something that I think I can answer comprehensively because they are similar, yes, but also I think different. Though even the exact mechanic of the ring is it's difficult to determine. It's difficult to completely pin down. It's because we get Bilbo living such an unusually long amount of time, like such a huge amount of lifespan for a hobbit, but then he's still alive 20 years later when it's time to go to the Grey Havens. So the removal of the ring from his possession and even the destruction of the ring isn't enough to just suddenly make all that time catch up with Bilbo. He still lives way, way, way past the usual extended lifespan. So it's tricky. Yeah. Glad Rebecca is saying the ring's lengthening out of your life. It wears you out, not just that it's evil. Yeah, like butter spread over too much bread, as Bilbo says. But there doesn't necessarily seem to be that same stretching feeling, right? I suppose, in fact, that is exactly the contrast that we're looking for. That the ring unnaturally prolongs your life. All the rings, it would seem, or at least the rings of man, for reasons which, again, we'll foreshadow in next week's reading. Those rings prolong your life, and the Silmaril seems to consume it, seems to burn it, seems to burn through the fuel of your life in much the same way as Fëanor, of course, burned through the fuel of his mother's life. That's perhaps the closest comparison that we can draw there. All right, back to Middle-earth, back, because I'm sure you've missed them, to the sons of Fëanor. Now when first Vingalot was set to sail in the seas of heaven, it rose unlooked for, glittering and bright, and the people of Middle-earth beheld it from afar and wondered, and they took it for a sign and called it Gil Estel, the star of high hope. And when this new star was seen at evening, Maithros spoke to Maglor, his brother, and he said, "Surely that is a Silmaril that shines now in the west." And Maglor answered, "If it be truly the Silmaril which we may cast into the... If it be truly the Silmaril which we saw cast into the sea that rises again by the power of the Valar, then let us be glad, for its glory is seen now by many, and yet secure from all evil." Then the elves looked up and despaired no longer, but Morgoth was filled with doubt. Yet it is said that Morgoth looked not for the assault that came upon him from the west, for so great was his pride become that he deemed that none would ever again come with open war against him. Moreover, he thought that he had forever estranged the Noldor from the lords of the west, and that content in their blissful realm, the Valar would heed no more his kingdom in the world without. For to him that is pitiless, the deeds of pity are ever strange and beyond reckoning. But the host of the Valar prepared for battle, and beneath their white banners marched the Vanyar, the people of Ingwe, and those also of the Noldor who never departed from Valinor, whose leader was Finarfin, the son of Finwë. Few of the Teleri were willing to go forth to war, for they remembered the slaying at the Swan Haven and the rape of their ships. But they hearkened to Elwing, who was the daughter of Eärendil and came of their own kindred, and they sent mariners enough to sail the ships that bore the host of Valinor east over the sea. Yet they stayed aboard their vessels, and none of them set foot upon the hither lands. You can almost imagine the ironic cut in the movie adaptation, right, between the last slide and this one. You get the rising music, triumphant and romantic, and old John Williams, Vinaiglot in the starlit sky, the white speck of Elwing rising to meet at this moment of absolute triumph and of romance. Maybe you cut to the deck of Vinaiglot and Eärendil smiles for the first time and who knows how long, and then we get this hard, jarring cut to silence and silhouette, Maithros and Maglor standing on a rise at sunset, seeing the object of their oath now forever out of their reach. Cut to black and credits, right? But except not that, because what we see here is another example of wisdom, of the desire of these sons of Fëanor to push back against the constraints of their oath. They identify it immediately, right? Maithros spoke to Maglor, his brother, and he said, "Surely that is a Silmaril that shines now in the west." And Maglor answered, "If it is, then that's great, because now it's being shared. That's fantastic. And it's secure from all evil, including us. It is now so comprehensively outside of our ability to ever reclaim it that we cannot be driven by our oath. That one is out there, right? There's no way that our oath can constrain us. Valar or demon or elf or man as yet unborn, fine. But space? I don't think that we can go to space." So he's freed in that moment. And we see, then the elves looked up and despaired no longer, but Morgoth was filled with doubt, right? This is a good thing. It is a beacon of hope. It is hope returning. That moment of eucatastrophe that we saw right there in the Calacaria, right? That moment of dual and symmetrical eucatastrophe, the coming of hope to Valinor and the coming of hope from Valinor. It's not just a temporary state of affairs. It's not just a moment. Things are changing. Something has shifted in the underpinning of Arda, and we're about to see it, in fact, because it consists largely of this giant host that is riding forth to war. I wanted to call out here, it's been such a long time since we talked about the different strands of elvendom, particularly in Valinor. But the Vanyar, the people of Ingwe, right? Those are the guys who were the most pro-Valar. They were the most pro-Valinorian. They went immediately to the mountain of Taniquetil and dwelt there upon the flanks of the mountain so they could be close to Manwë. And then the Noldor who didn't go, right? Those who are, in fact, it's right after, I believe, the taking of the oath, that Finarfin just turns around and heads back. He's like, no, I'm out. He's the one son of Finwë that doesn't go. So we've got these strands. And the Teleri, of course, don't really want to go. They don't want to go to war because, much like the Green Elves of Asyrian, much like the Lyquendi, they have had the experience of war, and it has changed something within them. They are not warlike anymore, right? I mean, the Teleri were never that warlike. That's partly the tragedy of the kinslaying at Alqualondë, is, of course, that all they have are their slender bows, if you recall that passage. But they now are even less likely to go to war than they were before. But they are persuaded because you can track the whole thing, right? That because Dior is the son of Luthien, who was the daughter of King Thingol of Doriath, who was part of the Teleri before they departed, right? The Teleri were the third group of elves, so all of the Sindar are Teleri, all of the Lyquendi are Teleri, the Philothrim of Círdan are Teleri, and that branch of the Teleri that was then led by Olwe into the west. Those are all the same kind of original branch of elvendom back from Cuivianen, right? They all started out together. So the army is coming, and we should get to the fight, I guess, right? Of the march of the host of the Valar to the north of Middle-earth, little is said in any tale, for among them went none of those elves who had dwelt and suffered in the Hitherlands, and who made the histories of those days that still are known. And tidings of these things that they only learned long afterwards from their kinsfolk in Aman. But at the last the might of Valinor came up out of the west, and the challenge of their trumpets of Eärendil filled the sky, and Beleriand was ablaze with the glory of their arms, for the host of the Valar were arrayed in forms young and fair and terrible, and the mountains rang beneath their feet. The meeting of the hosts of the west and of the north is named the Great Battle and the War of Wrath. There was marshaled the whole power of the throne of Morgoth, and it had become great beyond count, so that Anfauglith could not contain it, and all the north was aflame with war. But it availed him not. The Balrogs were destroyed, save some few that fled and hid themselves in caverns inaccessible at the roots of the earth, and the uncounted legions of the orcs perished like straw in a great fire, or were swept like shriveled leaves before a burning wind. Few remained to trouble the world for long years after. And such few as were left of the three houses of the elf friends, fathers of men, fought upon the part of the Valar. And they were avenged in those days for Baragund and Barahir, Galdor and Gondor, Huor and Húrin, and many others of their lords. But a great part of the sons of men, whether of the people of Uldor or others new come out of the east, marched with the enemy, and the elves do not forget it. No elves of Middle-earth, no elves who had dwelt and suffered in the Hitherlands, no elves who write these kinds of history books at that point in history, went to fight in the battle. And that, I think, can strike some people as being a little odd, as being a little strange. So none of the survivors at the Haven of Sirion, if indeed there were any survivors at the Haven of Sirion, no one who has seen bloodshed at Nargothrond or Doriath or Gondolin, no one goes to fight. And the answer is, of course, that the Noldor were exiled from Valinor in the first place for wanting to go and fight Morgoth. Sure, Fëanor had some big words about the starlit skies of Cuivanen and about being thralls of the Valar and all of that, right? But we see through that almost immediately. Really, it is about the Silmarils. It is about going to Middle-earth to go and fight Morgoth, to go and conquer Morgoth and to reclaim the Silmarils. And because of the judgment that lays upon the Noldor, because of the doom of Mandos, they can't be sanctioned in that choice. They don't get to be heroes in this fight because choosing this fight was the wrong choice. There's an entirely different motivation underpinning the host of the Valar here that rides forth. We don't co-sign their rebellion here. We don't co-sign the flight of the Noldor in the first place. Glorfin David's finding it strange that after so many tales of Morgoth's troublemaking, he's gone over the course of like 4 paragraphs. This is the other mode that I was talking about, right? This is where we ascend back into the quasi-mythic, certainly, but really into the sweep of history. And that is because the elves who are writing the histories at this point aren't there. They don't leave the Haven of Sirion. They don't leave the Isle of Valar. They don't go to the war. So we don't really know what happens. We're given accounts, right? And you'll note the little twist there, the little turn, the little foreshadowing of what is going to happen. These things they only learned long afterwards from their kinsfolk in Aman. Oh, I see. We're going to go back to Aman. Okay, interesting, right? The elves of Middle-earth are never going to be given like a comprehensive history of what happens here. Only back in Valinor will this story be told fully, will it be told truly. But you can't deny the mythic power here, right? But at last the might of Valinor came up out of the west, and the challenge of the trumpets of Eärendil filled the sky, and Beleriand was ablaze with the glory of their arms, and the host of the Valar were arrayed in forms young and fair and terrible, and the mountains rang beneath their feet. What's interesting here is that as far as the composition of the army is concerned, right? The host of the Valar, this army, young and fair and terrible, coming into Beleriand to finally rid the world of Morgoth. As far as its composition is concerned, we don't really know for sure who is here. We know for sure that Eärendil is here, right? But it's unclear how many other Maiar and or Valar are here. On the one hand, we don't get an account of Orome and of Tukas, of course, going down into Angband and dragging Morgoth out by his hair, right? We don't get this account of an elite armed battalion of Maiar going toe-to-toe with their Balrogian counterparts. We don't get a clean perspective on who exactly is here. We know that the remnant of the Edain are there, right? The sons of man. We get the elf friends going forth once more to join in with the host of elves, but we don't know. Is this army entirely elves plus Eonwe? Is that it? Or are there Maiar among their number? Are there Valar among their number? It's like the most compelling piece of evidence in support of there being Ainur in the army comes, I suppose, as we will see, in the utter destruction of Beleriand. Beleriand is going to be like geographically destroyed by this war, which echoes the kind of damage done during the first battle with Morgoth back in distant history. Back when Morgoth, then Melkor, went to war with the Valar, and the destruction was so great that the Valar had to retreat to Aman and build the Pelori and kind of preserve Valinor as a safe space because they couldn't risk another open war with Morgoth and the destruction of the children of Iluvatar because they didn't know where the children of Iluvatar were yet, right? They hadn't properly awakened and they could not risk that kind of collateral damage. So it seems to me that the composition here is such that I expect there to be at least Maiar, along with Eonwe, probably Valar too. I would hate to think that Tukas missed out on it, is one of the things that I'm thinking here, right? Orome, okay, he was always like, the joy of the hunt and whatever. Maybe this kind of massed conflict wasn't quite his style, but you'd think that Tukas would want to be wading in there. But then again, if Tukas is there, we definitely don't need Eärendil to perform his last-minute save, which we will get to in just a moment. In fact, let's get to it right now. Then, seeing his hosts were overthrown and his power dispersed, Morgoth quailed, and he dared not to come forth himself, but he loosed upon his foes the last desperate assault that he had prepared, and out of the pits of Angband there issued the winged dragons that had not before been seen. And so sudden and ruinous was the onset of that dreadful fleet that the host of the Valar was driven back, for the coming of the dragons was with great thunder and lightning and a tempest of fire. But Eärendil came, shining with white flame, and about Vingulot were gathered all the great birds of heaven, and Thorondor was their captain, and there was a battle in the air all the day and through a dark night of doubt. Before the rising of the sun, Eärendil slew Ancalagon the Black, the mightiest of the dragon host, and cast him from the sky, and he fell upon the towers of Thangorodrim, and they were broken in his ruin. Then the sun rose, and the host of the Valar prevailed, and well nigh all the dragons were destroyed, and all the pits of Morgoth were broken and unroofed, and the might of the Valar descended into the deeps of the earth. There Morgoth stood at last at bay, and yet unvaliant. He fled into the deepest of his mines, and sued for peace and pardon, but his feet were hewn from under him, and he was hurled upon his face. Then he was bound with the chain Anganor, which he had worn aforetime, and his iron crown they beat into a collar for his neck, and his head was bowed upon his knees. And the two Silmarils which remained to Morgoth were taken from his crown, and they shone unsullied beneath the sky, and Eonwe took them and guarded them. So, Ancalagon the Black, we should probably talk about, right? The rushing jaws, clearly canonically the first flying dragon, if we weren't already convinced by Glaurung that Glaurung could not in fact fly, then this is the proof, right? They issued the winged dragons that had not before been seen, and Calagan is one of these dragons. And Calagan is referenced, in fact, in Chapter 2 of The Lord of the Rings, as Gandalf talks with Frodo. I pulled the quote here just because it's so good. In Gandalf voice, I guess. It has been said that dragon fire could melt and consume the rings of power, but there is not now any dragon left on earth in which the old fire is hot enough, nor was there ever any dragon, not even Ancalagon the Black, who could have harmed the One Ring, the ruling ring, for that was made by Sauron himself. So, Ancalagon the Black, one of those tiny little details that makes it to the Lord of the Rings and might inspire you to believe that if you go and crack open the Silmarillion, you're going to find out a lot of stuff about Ancalagon the Black, and it turns out that you won't. You will find out that he is slain by Eärendil, who arrives in Vingulot with all the great birds of heaven and Thorondor as their captain, and there's this aerial battle for the first time in all of the history of Arda, and it rages through the night, right, through a dark night of doubt. There's typology happening here too, right? You can remember. We mentioned, in fact, last week, we mentioned the cock crowing at the siege of Gondor, right? Which is exactly the same kind of thing. You fight through the hopeless night, and then before the rising of the sun, Eärendil slew Ancalagon the Black, the mightiest of the dragon host. Then the sun rose and the host of the Valar prevailed. That's a very familiar rhythm if you've been reading Tolkien battle scenes through The Lord of the Rings in particular. And Morgoth hides and flees into the deepest basements, the deepest sub basements of Angband here. But there is no hiding place left. He is bound again with the chain Angainor, which was made by Aule back, thousands of years before he is chained for the first time, if you recall, before he becomes a captive in Valinor for the first time. And the iron crown they beat into a collar for his neck, and his head was bowed upon his knees. And so, it is over. It is done. Oh, I wanted to call out too here the fulfillment, of that Fey prophetic vision that Fëanor has right before he dies, when he understands that the Noldor will never cast down Thangordrim, and now look, Thangordrim is cast down. The peaks of Thangordrim are cast down by the descent of the ruined body of Ancalagon the Black. Let's get to. Let's find out what happens with these Silmarils, huh? We've only got a few slides left, and that seems to be. I'm getting these broadcast error messages again. I need to pull my entire system apart here in the studio and reinstall everything, because it's always around this time of the evening. I feel like it's always around 90 minutes in that my broadcast software starts giving me these little packet errors. And yet when I go back and I look at the video, I don't seem to have lost any packets. So I don't understand what's happening. A problem for another day. Thus an end was made of the power of Angband in the north, and the evil realm was brought to naught. And out of the deep prisons a multitude of slaves came forth beyond all hope into the light of day, and they looked upon a world that was changed. For so great was the fury of those adversaries that the northern regions of the western world were rent asunder, and the sea roared in through many chasms, and there was confusion and great noise, and rivers perished or found new paths, and the valleys were upheaved, and the hills trod down, and Sirion was no more. Then Eonwe, as herald of the elder king, summoned the elves of Beleriand to depart from Middle-earth. But Maithros and Maglor would not hearken, and they prepared, though now with weariness and loathing, to attempt in despair the fulfillment of their oath. For they would have given battle for the Silmarils were they withheld, even against the victorious host of Valinor, even though they stood alone against all the world. And they sent a message, therefore, to Eonwe, bidding him yield up now those jewels which of old Fëanor their father made, and Morgoth stole from him. But Eonwe answered that the right to the work of their father, which the sons of Fëanor formerly possessed, had now perished, because of their many and merciless deeds, being blinded by their oath, and most of all because their slaying of Dior and the assault upon the havens. The light of the Silmarils should go now into the west, whence it came in the beginning, and to Valinor must Maithros and Maglor return, and there abide the judgment of the Valar, by whose decree alone would Eonwe yield the jewels from his charge. Then Maglor desired indeed to submit, for his heart was sorrowful, and he said, The oath says not that we may not bide our time, and it may be that in Valinor all shall be forgiven and forgot, and we shall come into our own in peace. Indeed, the oath says nothing about biding your time, because you'll recall how long they spent hanging out. I mean, yes, beleaguering, Angband, right? Absolutely guarding the march of Maithros to the northeast of Beleriand there, but they weren't actively pursuing the Silmarils for like a good 400 years there. I think the power of this is so simple and so elegant and so completely inevitable, right? I'm observing here, albeit obliquely, another shift in our rhetorical register as we descend once more from the heights of the War of Wrath, from the battle that has, even in the first passages we see here, that has destroyed Beleriand, right? Beleriand has not yet sunk completely below the sea. It does not sink all at once, per Atlantis. In fact, it does not sink entirely, right? There are a couple of places that persist. The Hill of Himring persists. The burial place of Morwen, of course, as we talked about before, persists. There are a couple of, and Linden, that like sliver of land, persists. But most of Beleriand is going to be completely destroyed by this. So Eonwe summons the elves back. A mistake was made. You should not have gone. Now you have to come back. Though again, you'll note, right, it is a summoning, again, much as the last summoning, but it is still respectful of their free will. No one is being compelled to return. They're being asked, invited. They're being summoned to return. But this oath is now, it has turned so sour within the hearts of the sons of Fëanor that there's, well, you know what? Let's get immediately on to the next slide, because that is where the debate really happens. So we'll introduce it here with Maglor desiring indeed to submit, right? Eomer says, look, I am not going to give up the Silmarils. It's not my place to give up the Silmarils. I'm not going to do that until I hear from the Valar what should be done with the Silmarils. You should come to Valinor and face judgment for what you have done, for the terrible crimes that you have committed, the slaying of Dior, the fall, the ruin of Doriath, and the assault upon the havens of Sirion, right? Like, 2 kinslayings basically back to back is not a great look for the sons of Fëanor. You should come back, face your judgment, and then the Valar will decide what to do with the Silmarils, right? This right to them that you once claimed has now been lost. You have lost it because of your many and merciless deeds. And Maglor has this moment of, well, okay, you know, technically, there's nothing in the rulebook that says that we can't go back to Valinor and just hang out and bide our time. We can just wait to see what will happen, and maybe everything will be okay. And then we get their debate. But Maethros answered that if they returned to Aman, but the favour of the Valar were withheld from them, then their oath would still remain, but its fulfilment be beyond all hope. And he said, who can tell to what dreadful doom we shall come if we disobey the powers in their own land, or purpose ever to bring war again into their holy realm? Yet Maglor still held back, saying, if Manwë and Varda themselves deny the fulfilment of an oath to which we named them in witness, is it not made void? And Maethros answered, but how shall our voices reach to Ilúvatar beyond the circles of the world? And by Ilúvatar we swore in our madness, and called the everlasting dark upon us if we kept not our word. Who shall release us? If none can release us, said Maglor, then indeed the everlasting darkness shall be our lot, whether we keep our oath or break it. But less evil shall we do in the breaking. Yet he yielded at last to the will of Maethros, and they took counsel together on how they could lay hands on the Silmarils, and they disguised themselves, and came in the night to the camp of Eonwë, and crept into the place where the Silmarils were guarded, and they slew the guards and laid hands on the jewels. Then all the camp was raised against them, and they prepared to die, defending themselves until the last. But Eonwë would not permit the slaying of the sons of Fëanor, and departing unfought, they fled far away. Each of them took to himself a Silmaril, for they said, since one is lost to us, but 2 remain, and we 2 alone of our brothers, so it is plain that fate should have us share the heirlooms of our father. A 4th, final, minor kinslaying, but a kinslaying nonetheless. The desperation here is palpable. It is immediate. We are now, again, as I say, so close to these characters that we can feel in their dialogue and in their action how much they are hurting, how difficult the oath has become, what a burden the oath has become to them, right? As Maethros points out, who can tell to what dreadful doom we shall come if we disobey the powers in their own land? Okay, so we do what you say. We go back to Valinor, and then they decide that they're not going to give us the Silmarils, and then what? Because we are still bound by the oath, and we are just going to cause war in Valinor. Like the punishment that would befall us then is going to be far worse than anything that can befall us now. And Maglor tries to find his way out of it, right? He tries to lawyer his way around this. If Manwë and Varda themselves deny the fulfillment of the oath to which we named them in witness, well, we made this oath citing them as witnesses, citing Taniquetil as a witness, weirdly. If they say that it's no longer an oath, does that mean that we're free? And Maethros answers again, right? Again, not, I think, trying to argue his brother into a particular route of action, but rather in his despair, he points out, we can't ask Ilúvatar to release us from our oath, and we named him as a witness as well. There's no way out of this. How shall our voices reach to Ilúvatar beyond the circles of the world? This, by the way, is one of the very few references that we get to any kind of idea of prayer. I meant to mention this earlier when we were talking about Eärendil, right? And his prayers were answered. Prayers there, meaning in the older Latin form, the word means plea. His request, his need was met in that moment. It's not the idea that he is praying in the modern religious sense in that moment. But this is what Maethros is talking about. How shall our voices reach to Ilúvatar beyond the circles of the world? There is no concept of prayer here in Middle-earth. There is no concept of being in a communion with the distant God. And even in this, right, the tragedy here is really heartbreaking, honestly, right? As Maglor points out, if none can release us, then indeed the everlasting darkness shall be... Okay, so you're right. There's no way out. We can't just go to Valinor and wait it out because of the risk. We can't have someone else intercede and release us from our oath. That means that we're going to wind up in the everlasting darkness, whatever that is, right? Whatever this kind of conceptual antithetical thing to the flame imperishable is, whatever this awful opposite is to all life and light in the universe, will end up in the everlasting darkness anyway. Then we should break it because we will do less evil. But you can't make that choice. You cannot, bound by an oath of this strength, bound by an oath of this power. It happens anyway. Yet he yielded at last to the will of Maithras, and they took counsel together on how they could lay hands on the sun. They are compelled by the oaths that they made to play this out, right? So they go into the camp and they slay the guards and they take the Silmarils, and then they are ready to die. They prepared to die, defending themselves until the last. But Eomwe would not permit the slaying of the sons of Fëanor, and departing unfought, they fled far away, and they split the Silmarils between them. And then we get the final fate of the Silmarils. But the jewel burned the hand of Maithras in pain unbearable, and he perceived that it was as Eonwe had said, and that his right thereto had become void, and that his oath was vain. And being in anguish and despair, he cast himself into a gaping chasm filled with fire, and so ended. And the Silmaril that he bore was taken into the bosom of the earth. And it is told of Maglor that he could not endure the pain with which the Silmaril tormented him, and he cast it at last into the sea. And thereafter he wandered ever upon the shores, singing in pain and regret beside the waves. For Maglor was mighty among the singers of old, named only after Dairun of Doriath. But he never came back among the people of the elves. And thus it came to pass that the Silmarils found their long homes, one in the airs of heaven, one in the fires of the heart of the world, and one in the deep waters. In those days there was a great building of ships upon the shores of the western sea, and thence in many a fleet the Eldar set sail into the west, and came never back to the lands of weeping and of war. And the Vanyar returned beneath their white banners, and were borne in triumph to Valinor. But their joy in victory was diminished, for they returned without the Silmarils from Morgoth's crown, and they knew that those jewels could not be found or brought together again unless the world be broken and remade. And when they came into the west, the elves of Beleriand dwelt upon Tol Eressëa, the lonely isle that looks both west and east, whence they might even come to Valinor. They were admitted again to the love of Manwë and the pardon of the Valar, and the Teleri forgave their ancient grief, and the curse was laid to rest. All at once we conclude. I want to quote the beat here from Chapter 7, from the moment in which the Silmarils are created and shown first to the Valar. This is the quote. And Varda hallowed the Silmarils so that thereafter no mortal flesh, nor hands unclean, nor anything of evil will might touch them, but it was scorched and withered. And Mandos foretold that the fates of Arda, earth, sea, and air lay locked within them. The heart of Fëanor was fast bound to these things that he himself had made. And we see everything in that short passage come to pass. The evil that has been done in the pursuit of the Silmarils has rendered Maithras unworthy. Maithras and Maglor, of course, unworthy, right? Evil will, for sure, that they be scorched and withered. And Mandos' prophecy that the Silmarils would wind up in earth, sea, and air has also come true. And the weeping here, it's not that we want the Silmarils for themselves. They returned without the Silmarils from Morgoth's crown. They knew these jewels would not be found or brought together again unless the world be broken and remade. It's the loss of the light. It's the loss of the light of the trees. Now the Silmarils have been returned. And remember, we want the Silmarils because Yavanna believes that she can rekindle the trees resurrect the trees of Valinor with that light. That was why she asks Fëanor for it in the first place. But they're lost now. There will be no new Telperion, no new Laurelin in Valinor, and the Silmarils will be where they are for the whole history of Arda, right? Until the world is broken and remade, they will be in the air, in the earth, and in the sea. Maglor's final fate here is beautifully poetic and tragic. And, the final proof, if proof were needed. Well, I suppose, right, we can see a certain valor from Maithras here too. Being in anguish and despair, he cast himself into a gaping chasm filled with fire, and so ended, right? He takes his own life and he takes the Silmaril with him, for sure. But there is a kind of heroism, right? Realizing the evil that he has done has turned him into someone who cannot fulfill his oath. That is the only path left open to him. But Maglor's is sadder and even more simple, that he just throws it into the ocean and then wanders upon the shores singing in pain and regret beside the waves, and never comes back to the elves, never rejoins a community, is just this solitary figure of haunting regret and grief forever, which is maybe deserved. Maybe it's hard, of course, to turn that corner right at the end of the story and feel pity for the Sons of Fëanor, particularly on the heels of that, again, a minor kinslaying, but a kinslaying nonetheless there at Eonway's camp. And so the elves depart Beleriand. Not all of them, crucially, but by far the largest part of their population. Yes, the elves depart Beleriand. We will find out more of the others in next week's reading. Let's finish this thing up then. I'm very pleased with the progress that we've made today. This is pretty great. I should mention some timeline stuff here too, because I know some people are stumbling a little bit on this, because our last note about Maglor was that actually, though he is bound by his oath and forced to do terrible things by the oath that he so rashly made, he's still a decent dude and manages to raise Elros and Elrond quite well, and that love grows between them. And that can be hard to reconcile with this notion of him being ruined now by the Silmarillion, wandering desolate on the shores of Middle-earth. But 50 years have passed between those two events. 50 years have passed. The War of Wrath is not a brief event. It takes a long time to unfold. So 50 years since the destruction of the Havens of Sirion, and the presumed loss of Elwing and the Silmaril into the ocean, and the taking of Elros and Elrond half-elven. Let's wrap this up with the final fate of Morgoth then. Yet not all the Adalier were willing to forsake the hitherlands where they had long suffered and long dwelt, and some lingered many an age in Middle-earth. Among those were Círdan the shipwright, and Celeborn of Doriath with Galadriel his wife, who alone remained of those who led the Noldor to exile in Beleriand. In Middle-earth dwelt also Gil-galad the High King, and with him was Elrond half-elven, who chose, as was granted to him, to be numbered among the Eldar. But Elros his brother chose to abide with man. And from these brethren alone has come among men the blood of the firstborn and a strain of the spirits divine that were before Arda. For they were the sons of Elwing, Dior's daughter, Lúthien's son, child of Thingol and Melian, and Eärendil their father was the son of Idril Celebrimbor, Turgon's daughter of Gondolin. But Morgoth himself the valor thrust through the door of night beyond the walls of the world into the timeless void. And a guard is set forever on those walls, and Eärendil keeps watch upon the ramparts of the sky. Yet the lies that Melkor the mighty and accursed Morgoth Bauglir, the power of terror and of hate, sowed in the hearts of elves and man, are a seed that does not die and cannot be destroyed, and ever and anon it sprouts anew, and will bear dark fruit even unto the latest days. So we get a brief foreshadowing here, some of the characters that will be important if we should ever return to the world of Middle-earth, the world of Arda, and we name check basically everyone we've been tracking, right? Círdan the shipwright, Celeborn of Doriath with Galadriel, his wife, is maybe the only time that Celeborn is going to get first billing in that particular partnership, right? Of course, we know how her story will work out. Gil-galad, the High King, with him was Elrond half-elven, and we get this note. This is going to be, as I say, revisited next week, that Elrond makes the choice to be counted among the Eldar, and Elros makes the choice to be counted among the men. And from him is going to come the line of Númenor. That's where we're going to wind up in next week's reading in the Akalabeath. But Morgoth himself, the valor thrust through the door of night beyond the walls of the world into the timeless void. We mentioned before Tolkien's taste for cosmic horror, but it doesn't get much more cosmic horror than this ancient and infinite evil being cast out into space, and a guard set forever on those walls, and Eärendil keeps watch upon the ramparts of the sky. This weirdly mixed metaphor that nonetheless works perfectly for me, right? It's such a powerful image, and that his influence, even that there is something here that remains of him, even though he now is absent. Yet the lies that Melkor, the mighty and accursed Morgoth Bauglir, the power of terror and hate, sowed in the hearts of elves and men, that his influence is going to persist. There will always be evil because he kindled it. He sowed it here, and it will always bear this dark fruit, which is so incredibly powerful. It is the year 590 of the years of the sun. And though we are not going to mark it here, though no one is going to actually observe this moment of passing, this is the end of the First Age. And it's not just the end of the First Age. It is also... Wait, what? Here ends the Silmarillion. If it has passed from the high and the beautiful to darkness and ruin, that was of old the fate of Arda marred. And if any change shall come and the marring be amended, Manwë and Varda may know, but they have not revealed it, and it is not declared in the dooms of Mandos. This is the end of the Quenta Silmarillion. This is the end of the story of the Silmarils, right? That is what the Quenta Silmarillion means, the heart of this book, which, as I mentioned earlier, right, has been has been incorporated within this larger structure, because we had the Eärendil all the way back, we had the Vala Quenta, then we had the entirety of the Quenta Silmarillion, this thing that we have spent months reading through together, the history of the Silmarils and the First Age of Middle-earth, of Arda in general. And then we're going to wrap up with the Akalabaeth, a glimpse at Numenor and the Second Age, and then a glimpse at the Third Age too. But this is obviously the fullest body of the work. And as I say, I wonder if Christopher Tolkien would have made the same choices if he had known that he would have had the opportunity to compile many, many more books than just this one relatively slender volume. And of course, the irony there is that in part he goes off to prepare the History of Middle-earth series, the Lost Tales, the Unfinished Tales, all that other stuff, because of the response, both positive and negative, to the Silmarillion. Because people saying, you made this up. This isn't even your father's work. You wrote half of this, I bet. And he goes to his father's work. He goes to his father's manuscripts and demonstrates over the course of 25 years and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages that is not, in fact, the case. And Galadriel is calling out a really interesting point here. There's an element of poetic justice here too, recalling that long ago Melkor went into the void to find the flame imperishable, and thus he has been returned to the void. Very good, Galadriel. I hadn't put that together, but that's really great, right? Particularly with that comparison with the dark that we were discussing with Maithras and Maglor. Yeah, I really love that. And the irony there too, of course, is that Melkor goes out into the dark by himself to seek the flame imperishable, failing to understand it, like failing in his first test to understand that the flame imperishable is with Iluvatar, that it is the force of creation that Iluvatar is exercising at that moment, that is where it is. And it is not by rebellion, it is not by discord that he gains power, it is by, well, concord, by harmony, by... I'm hesitant to use the word unity, right? Because unity is something that we associate with Melkor. It's something that we associate with the powers of evil in the world of Arda. But with collaboration, with cooperation, with each learning better the mind and the power of the others around him. This constant diversity, this constant seeking for things unlike ourselves, which enriches our own experience that we've been talking about literally since the Eärendil, right? That is almost the foundational beat of the entire Legendarium, is that desire for things which are other than ourselves. But you're right, being exiled and being alone in his exile, brooding on the edges of the door of night, right? Being right out there against this guarded door with Eärendil occasionally swinging by in his glowing ship just to say, hey, keeping an eye on you, buddy. It's powerful. And as you say, poetic that we're exercising that symmetry here at that point. And that is the story of Eärendil. That is the story of the Quenta Silmarillion. That is the story of the First Age of Arda. But we, as I said before, are not done. I will call up this slide here to indicate that next week we're going to look at the Akalabaeth. And if you have been reading your Silmarillion, you will be raising an eyebrow, or possibly even two, scandalously, at the news that we are going to spend a single week on the Akalabaeth. This is soft. I'm not necessarily committing to the idea that we are going to finish both of the last parts of this book in 1 week, but I don't think that we are going to do quite the same level of close reading that we've been doing moving through the Quenta, partly because it is less narrative, right? We're doing more of a gloss of history. And I'm not sure how at this point to really approach Of the Rings of Power in the Third Age, because obviously it's fantastic. Obviously it's a great story and I really want to talk about it. But at the same time, it is so dependent on an interconnectivity with the Lord of the Rings. It's so referential. There's so much there that we're kind of just tying together. It's a lot of, a string of bullet points in my notes saying, oh, this is related to this, and this is related to this, and oh, did you notice how we're inverting this? And did you notice how the hobbits barely get mentioned, and things like that. So I'm not quite sure of our reading strategy for Of the Rings of Power in the Third Age. I'm not completely settled on a reading strategy for the Akalabaeth either. As I say, it's not my favorite part of the book, which also kind of dissuades me a little bit from spending 2 weeks on it. I mean, it certainly wouldn't justify more than 2 weeks. So lest you be afraid that we are not going to get to the work of Jane Austen and our next unit until, I don't know, October or something. We are at most going to do 4 more weeks, and that is if I take the longest possible approach to both the Akalabeath and of the Rings of Power in the Third Age. I think we'll probably split that. I think it will probably turn into 3 more sessions in the Silmarillion series, and that will round us out. I'm thinking also about a bonus Q&A session if I have time, but I'm also really warming up the new Tolkien show that is going to pick up, I think, the week after we're done with the Silmarillion. I don't think there's going to be a break in broadcast there, so stay tuned. Stay tuned for that. I'm really excited. I'm really enjoying the preparatory work on that. I will probably, I mean, since we're getting so close, I really should have something for you in the very near future. Maybe we will talk about it next week. Maybe I'll do a special Patreon thing and just talk a little. I need to record a 0 episode for the show and get it out so the feed gets established and all of that stuff, so you can subscribe to it before the show really starts when we hit the ground running, because I think you're really going to like it. So thank you for all of your support, for all of the many, many, many emails that I've received through the course of the Silmarillion so far. The Quenta in particular, I think, has really kind of caught your imaginations in a lot of ways, and mine too. I have thoroughly enjoyed reading it this carefully and reading it at this pace, and really enjoying these stories as they unfold. So thank you to everyone who got in touch with me about covering the Silmarillion, because I have loved it so much that I'm going to do a whole new show. And then Stars and Swords is going to be about, genre fiction the way it was supposed to be in a more general sense. As I say, next we are going to cover, if you haven't been keeping up, we're going to cover Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen, which I'm really excited to look at. And then I've got a soft list through the end of the year. We're probably going to do 3, if not 4 more books after Austen through the end of the year, and our return to Narnia, of course, around Christmas time, as is traditional here, as we approach our 3rd Christmas in Stars and Swords, which seems crazy, but here we are. That is going to do it then for this week. Next week, at least the beginning of the Akalabeath. We're going to try and make through as much of it as we can, but at least the beginning of the Akalabeath, maybe even the whole thing. Who knows? Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for your support. If you want to join me live for these sessions, which are so much fun, as Galadriel Becky and Glorfin David, I'm sure, can attest, then you can head on over to the Patreon page, patreon.com/nextword. Sign up to that page for free. Just follow that page using your Patreon profile, and you will get the links to these live sessions. You can come and hang out in the chat. You don't have to wait for the podcast to be released. You get the whole thing live and spontaneous, usually on a Thursday evening, sometimes on a Sunday evening, sometimes on a Sunday afternoon. The vicissitudes of fate just prevent me from being completely certain about when this show will ever come out. That's at patreon.com/nextword. And you can also pledge your support there, of course, to help me keep doing this, to help me replace this entire system, which I guess keeps throwing me these packet errors as I'm broadcasting live. Or, you can leave a rating. You can leave a review. You can go to the places where people do those things. You can go to your iTunes. You can go to your Spotify. You can go to your Pocket Casts. You can find this podcast wherever it lives and, click a little button that says that you like it. And that will help other people find it, because they might like it too. That is going to do it for this week's show. Thank you so much. Thank you, Glorfin David. Thank you, Galadriel Becky. It was really fun to have you here for the story of Eärendil.